looks like an effort to rejuvenate the system and to prepare for the transition when Putin and his elderly colleagues, leave their positions. So it very much looks that way, and it's happening quite extensively. So there are signs probably that Putin and co recognize that their days in power are probably numbered.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're talking to John Lough, the head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategies Centre, a London-based think tank. John spent 7 years with NATO and was the first representative of the alliance to be based in Moscow. John, great to see you again. Welcome to Frontline.
Good morning. It's good to be with you.
So what do you think of the way the Kremlin is reacting to Donald Trump's ridiculing of Russia's failure to defeat Ukraine at the UN General Assembly, where he called Russia a paper tiger?
They're trying to play this down, and the Kremlin spokesman tried, I suppose, to respond with some humour, saying that Russia was a bear, not a tiger. So it seems as though they don't want to get into any sort of spat with Trump. I suspect that Putin will try and do another call with him at some point to sort of point Trump again in the right direction as far as the Russians are concerned, because it does often seem that he just adopts the view of the last person he's spoken to. And what was remarkable in New York was that he had a conversation with President Zelensky, where it seems that possibly for the first time he really responded to what Zelensky was telling him. And in a way, of course, that is significant because he hasn't done this before. He's obviously frustrated with the fact that Putin hasn't, if you like, agreed to dance the tango with him as he wanted. And after all, Trump literally rolled out the red carpet for him in Alaska a few weeks ago. And that really hasn't led to anything positive at all from Trump's perspective. On the contrary, in fact, Putin seems to be escalating, both the attacks on Ukraine and now this violation of Estonian airspace, which I think is extremely serious. And of course, the 24 drones that entered Poland. So these are not signs that Putin wants to come to the table and to find a solution to his problem in Ukraine. He wants to fight to the end.
Yes, it's interesting that you said you expect Putin to be offering a phone call or have a phone call with Donald Trump in the coming, soon. It's exactly what I thought, is how long before he gets on the phone and tries to sway him back. Do you think it is exactly what you said then that it's the last person he spoke to, Donald Trump? It's not the fact that Putin has actually finally overplayed his hand with Trump, because some analysts predicted he would do that at some stage and that it would be the final straw and that Trump would actually lose patience.
Well, I think Trump is losing patience. And the indications up until quite recently was that he was losing patience with both the Europeans and the Ukrainians. He at least feigned some irritation with the Russians and started talking about the possibility of increased sanctions. But it immediately became clear that he didn't want to do these sanctions. And I think he's never wanted, in fact, to introduce sanctions against Russia. And he uses this argument that you then close down the possibility for dealing with them. And Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has echoed this argument in recent days. So Trump's approach has been, therefore, to say to the Europeans, you need to be, aligned with me on sanctions, and we'll do it together, and we'll go after China and India, and we'll do some other things. And of course, Trump doesn't want to sanction China. He has introduced sanctions against India, allegedly for buying large quantities of Russian oil, but I think probably something else lies behind that. The Europeans are clearly not prepared to go along with this. Trump, to be fair, he does point out that the Europeans are funding Ukraine to fight its war at the same time as they're buying oil and gas from Russia. And that is, of course, perverse. He's not wrong on that point, although it has to be said that the Europeans have very significantly reduced those volumes of Russian hydrocarbons that they're buying, and will decrease them further to the point where by 2027, theoretically, they won't be taking any at all. So this question still remains about, what is Trump actually prepared to do to put pressure on Putin? And his tactic so far has just been to, flatter him. give him greater attention, in fact, lift the, if you like, the international isolation that was imposed on Putin after February 2022. But without results, what are his options? He can either keep trying, or he can just say, I've done as much as I can and it hasn't worked. But that makes him look weak. Or he can, blame somebody else for the fact that it hasn't worked out. But my sense is that if he concludes, and perhaps he has already concluded, that he can't resolve this war and make it the eighth war, I think in his estimation that he will have concluded, then he'll simply find a way to walk away and leave it to the Europeans. And this is, of course, what the Europeans are extremely worried about, because then, a heavy burden would fall on them. And it's not by coincidence that in the last couple of weeks, there's been serious talk now about how to deploy these Russian sovereign assets that have been frozen. What we have in Europe is worth about $200 billion. And some imaginative schemes have now appeared for, in fact, making those funds available to Ukraine in a way that they wouldn't be confiscated, because the lawyers have great concerns here about the sort of precedent that would be set. But the fact that Europeans have entered into that serious discussion suggests to me they are starting to realize that the US really isn't there. It's not going to fund this war further, and the burden is on their shoulders.
Yes, and Donald Trump seems happy, though, to continue to sell weapons under this new scheme with the Europeans that can be provided to Ukraine. And interestingly, that strange thing he wrote on Truth Social, which was, I wish both countries well, good luck to you all. It did seem like he was preparing to walk away, or that it's definitely firmly in his head as an option.
Yes, I think so. I mean, he may in some way believe that Putin still needs him, and Trump can play a role in helping Putin resolve his dilemma, because Putin's not exactly sitting pretty here. I was saying to somebody yesterday when I was asked this question, who's winning in Ukraine? And I was saying, really, nobody's winning at the moment. Russia should be winning, given its superiority in terms of numbers of soldiers, the size of its economy, the size of its defense industrial base. But it simply hasn't been able to bring that pressure to bear so far, to the point where Ukraine looks ready to surrender, or the front might buckle. They haven't reached that point yet. And really, to push further into Ukraine, as Putin clearly wants to do, and he wants to seize the Donbass region, I think that's his kind of minimum requirement now. He's probably going to need more manpower. And to do that, he would have to mobilize again. And the experience of mobilization back in September 2022 was not a happy one, because nearly 1 million people left the country at that point. And although some of them later returned, it's clear that this war is not popular in society, I think more broadly. And there may be a certain level of indifference to it. Of course, Russian society is quiescent for a whole series of reasons at the moment, including just the level of repression. But the authorities, as far as we can judge, are really concerned about this possible need then to mobilize further. So that's constraining Putin. I would say at the same time, the Ukrainians are having some success in probably slowing down the Russian advance, attacking Russian logistics, and more recently, their quite extensive attacks on the Russian oil and gas industry, notably the oil industry, where they've gone after refineries, oil terminals. They have the ability to strike in ways that they didn't, let's say, 12 months ago. So this is a complicating factor for Putin. It's not a decisive factor. But I think the summary really is that the longer he carries on fighting, the more difficult it becomes for him. So his assumption is still the Ukrainians will break if he just pushes a little bit further. The Europeans still think that just a bit more sanctions and Putin will think again. And the Ukrainians are left there just having to keep slugging it out, with of course problems on their side, particularly manpower. They're relying on the Western allies to keep them afloat economically. But I believe they can stay in this fight still for a long time.
And you say on the subject of the Russian manpower problems, I'm just wondering what your take is on this report that was from the Institute of the Study of War. They gave this update where they cite a report by someone who's usually accurate, a Russian source, pointing to this formation of the strategic reserve from new recruits. What is the imperative for Putin to keep the war going? I mean, he's obviously preparing to do it, and it looks like he is having success doing it.
Well, he can't lose this war. It's existential for him. And he and his close advisors seem to believe that it's winnable, and probably in the short term. But what I think is still a mystery for them is how Ukraine has been able to just achieve this level of resistance and resilience. And it really doesn't look as though, even though Russia is advancing at a snail's pace along parts of this, very long front line, it doesn't look as though they're anywhere close so far to achieving that decisive breakthrough. And even if they have occasionally broken through the front, and the front, one has to imagine it's not quite like the First World War. There aren't trenches in the same way, and certainly not trenches that are manned by lots of soldiers. It's very sparsely populated. And occasionally the Russians have been able to break through and penetrate maybe 10, 12 kilometers into Ukrainian territory. But they haven't been able to consolidate that gain because they don't have the forces behind them to do it. And most recently, where they punched through, the Ukrainians were able to redeploy some of their better units, and they pushed them back completely. And in fact, even I think advanced a little. So it's a really kind of mixed picture.
Yeah, I suppose I meant really the success in building up the strategic reserve rather than necessarily on the battlefield. I mean, how much, when you talk about the manpower problems, does that point to the fact that he's actually managing to fill the gaps at the moment and he's preparing for the long haul? Or do you think this is actually going to become a big problem fairly soon?
No, I don't think it's going to become a big problem very soon. I think we can just see increasingly they are having to pay more in terms of sign-on bonuses to maintain the level of recruitment, which is probably around 30 to 35,000 men a month. That's covering their losses. So that tells you they're sustaining very, very heavy losses. So they can keep on doing that. But in terms, I think, of building up a well-trained, substantial reserve that would allow Russia then to take this war to a higher level in Ukraine, I don't see any sign of that happening quickly.
You mentioned earlier the incursions, which are a very serious development that Russia has been conducting into NATO airspace. Why do you think this is happening now? Is it a sign of strength? Is it a sign of weakness? Or is it intended to distract the alliance from Ukraine?
I would suggest that it in some ways is intended to distract, in that if you think that Russia's not winning at the moment and they need to try to change the balance of forces on the battlefield, well, one way to do it is to make some of the neighbouring countries on the eastern flank there feel particularly insecure, to the point where NATO has to deploy, let's say, weapon systems. It has to deploy effort to support those countries, and that's effort and weapon supplies and things that otherwise might be going in the direction of Ukraine. So if you want to try to weaken Ukraine, then according to this logic, and I think this is Kremlin logic, then why not unnerve some NATO countries and watch how they then try to deal with that and continue supporting Ukraine? Because the Russians know that our resources are limited. The attention span of Western leaders, of course, is also limited. So I think they're trying to stretch us. This is definitely a test also of NATO's cohesion. They want to see just how the United States responds, to what extent the United States is still committed to the alliance. And here they've probably had some, mixed signals, because President Trump immediately said that when those probably 24 drones entered Polish airspace, he said this might be a mistake. And I suppose there is a tiny chance that this happened by mistake, but I discount that personally. I think this was absolutely deliberate. But he then said in the same breath, "I'm not going to defend anybody." Now, of course, that's going to be picked up on in Moscow. But just a few days later, the new US ambassador to the United Nations, Mike Waltz, the former national security advisor, made a very strong statement in his maiden speech at the UN and said that the US and its allies will defend every inch of NATO territory. So again, if you're sitting in Moscow, you'll say, well, I'm getting some mixed messages here. What is the situation really? And probably the Russians would conclude that from Waltz's statement that the US deep state is still there and Trump can't necessarily subdue it.
And you add to that the British Foreign Secretary and her Polish counterpart, and then the Polish Prime Minister, all expressing their willingness to shoot down Russian planes that enter NATO airspace in the future. How do you expect Putin to follow on from this? Do you think he's going to try and clarify in his own head what NATO is prepared to do and if so, what kind of move would potentially be the kind of move that's typical of the playbook?
Well, probably to some extent, he's been able to draw a conclusion because the NATO allies convened a couple of times in response to these, Article 4 situations where Poland and Estonia both requested consultations under the Washington Treaty. And NATO, a couple of days ago, issued a statement which, by its standards, I think was quite strong. When it came to its commitment to defend alliance territory. But it still left open how NATO might respond. So it did not say explicitly that NATO will shoot down aircraft that repeatedly violate its airspace after due warnings. So a lot of parallels have been made with what the Turks did in 2015 after Russian aircraft repeatedly violated their airspace. In fact, the Russians were attacking, I believe, forces in the civil war in Syria that were backed by Turkey. So this was a very sensitive issue for Turkey. And President Erdogan, at the time, took this decision that they would shoot down an aircraft if there were further incursions, and they did that. And of course, all hell was set loose for a few weeks, and the Russians imposed draconian economic sanctions on Turkey, and then Erdogan had to really sort of beg for forgiveness. People sort of forget that side of the story. But I mean, interestingly, Trump said 2 days ago, and he was in pretty exuberant form after his speech at the UN, that they should shoot down Russian aircraft that come into their airspace. But this is a big decision. The problem, I think, that the NATO faces is that in order to deter, you have to be prepared to escalate, and you have to signal that you're prepared to escalate. And some NATO countries are worried about even signaling because they believe that is already an escalation. And then they might really invite a Russian test and not, in fact, be up to it. So this is the problem when you're an alliance of 32 countries that has to take decisions by consensus. That this is a really very, very sensitive issue. So they're sort of playing around it slightly, and so that statement they made, although say by NATO standards, I think it was quite strong. It's still ambiguous. And is there really the ironclad commitment to do what would be necessary and send that signal?
Do you think then that there is likely to be another incidence of some kind of incursion?
Oh, I think it's highly likely, and it may just take a different form. And you look at the proliferation of cyber attacks at the moment, where we just don't know where they're coming from. I mean, this Jaguar Land Rover situation in the UK, for example, very serious, it seems, in terms of the functioning of that business, and hundreds of thousands of jobs then dependent on supplies to that plant. And yet we're not hearing about what was actually the cause of this. And could there be a Russian hand in it? I simply don't know, because we have no information. But from past experience, we know that Russia is very capable in this sphere. So I would expect to see more going on in that domain. And equally, there have been drones flying in parts of Denmark, I believe Norway, elsewhere. That again, the origin of these is not clear, and they may have been launched domestically, but by people recruited by other countries and possibly including Russia. So there'll probably be efforts, I think, to sow more confusion, to keep us on our guard, to keep us distracted, and that is part of the game, because ultimately the Russians want to find out, is there still substance to NATO or not? Are the Europeans, in fact, now on their own? So far, Europe has done actually a pretty good job, I think, in trying to just keep President Trump in the tent, and at least to create the impression that NATO is still an organization backed by the United States. Now, it may be backed by the US in some ways, but when it comes to the critical issue of Article 5, an attack on one country being an attack on all, will the US actually respond? And we simply don't know the answer to that question. And of course, in some ways, in NATO's history, it was always that way. We never knew exactly how the alliance would perform on the day if it got to that point. But the signals over the last 6 months from Washington have been very much that European defence is a matter for the Europeans.
Can I just ask you about something that has been reported by one of my colleagues in the Times? I'm interested to get your perspective on it. And it's about the situation inside the Russian Federation itself. Maxim Tucker was looking at what seems to be an increase in Putin appointing family members into government as part of a purge on disloyalty and corruption. What's going on? And do you see an increase? And if so, why? What's going on?
Yeah, certainly the people who study this situation closely have drawn attention to the fact that a number of, if you like, family members, I mean, even people related to Putin in one case, one person related to Putin, others related to some of his senior, if you like, allies, over recent years, close collaborators with him, that they are coming into positions in government. And this all looks like an effort to rejuvenate the system and to prepare for the transition when Putin and his elderly colleagues, leave their positions. So it very much looks that way, and it's happening quite extensively. So there are signs probably that Putin and co recognize that their days in power are probably numbered, but of course they want to ensure that they can live out their lives in relative comfort. And in the case of Putin, that there's no danger of him ending up in The Hague. So for that reason, he knows from his own personal experience of having been brought in by President Yeltsin in 1999 as, if you like, a guarantor of the Yeltsin family's security. So these personalist regimes always suffer from the fact that they don't know what will happen next when they are finally replaced. So they have to build, if you like, a sort of cadre of people who are loyal to them. And if you can do that through, people who are not Putin's appointed even some of his former bodyguards to quite significant positions. So you're talking about extreme levels of loyalty, introducing then, some families members as well. That all contributes to that. But how do those people among themselves actually then function together? That's always the big question.
So do you think that this is, it's not through a sense of vulnerability then, it's a sense of actually preparing for the future. It's not a sense of weakness.
No, I don't interpret it as a sense of weakness. I think the regime actually feels at the moment quite strong. There are no direct threats to its stability or security. That doesn't mean that they couldn't suddenly appear. And I think the Russian authorities, and this is a theme through Russian history, they do fear their own people. And they fear the people because the mood in the country can change rapidly. And we saw that at the end of the communist days. In particular, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union fractured in the way it did. So the Putin and those people around him at the apex of power, they know full well that if they were suddenly to become very unpopular, that the populace could turn on them. And there are plenty of people in the elites, I think, who are probably quite ambivalent about their commitment to this regime and realize that it's not permanent. So things in Russia can move very, very suddenly. And I think that explains why we're experiencing this, witnessing this degree of repression currently in Russia. This is, again, historically nothing unusual. But it points to the fact that just the way this country is governed is so different from anywhere else in Europe. And the public opinion in Russia, it does exist, and it's volatile. It's just unable to express itself at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's been described to me as a strong but brittle hold on power. I just want to ask you about the Moldovan parliamentary elections this weekend. They're either going to accelerate Moldova's entry into the European Union or push it closer to Moscow. And Russia has been accused of spreading lies, trying to buy hundreds of thousands of votes and even train potential saboteurs to cause riots. What can you tell us about what you know?
Yeah, I think for the Russian side, this is a kind of high stakes game. They've been frustrated over many years now by their inability to get a really sort of proper grip on Moldova. And I mean, talking to the people there in recent days, it seems that the Russian efforts to subvert this election, or at least to interfere to the point where their clients win, they are quite unprecedented. And there's speculation that Russia's maybe put as much as $200 million, $300 million into this election campaign. Now, there is a school of thought which I find actually very convincing, which is this is about far more than just Moldova's orientation. It's in fact related to the amount of criminal business that's carried out through Moldova from the from the Russian side. And so this is a country that's actually very conveniently located, next to Romania, an EU member, where a very large number of Moldovan citizens have in fact Romanian citizenship. So it's a place from which many of those criminal operations can be conducted. So I think you've got to add that into the factor, into the overall calculation that obviously Russia wants to constrain Moldova's ability to achieve accelerated integration of the EU. But even if let's say the current Moldovan administration were to stay in place, then I don't think we would see rapid entry of Moldova into the EU. Moldova set the target of 2030, but that looks to me extremely ambitious, just given that this is a very, very poor country with very serious problems of governance. When you look at the way the judicial bodies function, there are really serious problems there that are not anywhere near resolved, and certainly not to the level that would meet the standards of the European Union today. That said, it's a small country, so in theory you should be able to achieve results there quite quickly. But I think the experience of what the last 10 years since, or more since Moldova, signed an association agreement with the EU shows that progress has been pretty slow and painful.
Given that school of thought that you just outlined about the importance of Moldova to Russia, if it does go more towards the EU as a result of these parliamentary elections, what will the effect be on Russia, do you think?
I think probably quite limited in the first instance. I mean, since the war started, the full-scale war with Ukraine, the Ukrainians have closed the border with Moldova. And this has affected the functioning of a separatist regime that was established by Russia back in 1992. This place is called Transnistria, which has been one of the brakes on Moldova's economic development, indeed its integration with Europe. So it rather looks, if that situation persists, as though the Russians actually may lose a foothold there. And so I would think that if that were the case longer term, this would, in fact, affect both the balance of power in Moldova and its ability simply to carry out, domestic reforms and to start to improve the economic situation. I mean, the economy has barely grown there in the last 4 years at all. So, if Moldova were able to maintain this momentum towards Europe, I think it would signal to Russia that again, it's losing ground in one of those places where it actually held considerable influence. And you can see this happening elsewhere in the South Caucasus, in the case of Armenia, for example. And if you look also on up at the northern border, the fact that Finland and Sweden are both now in NATO, so the Baltic Sea doesn't offer the same opportunities it did before for Russia in terms of, if you like, sort of the geopolitical competition. But I think with Moldova, it's very difficult to call at the moment, and I suspect the outcome will be somewhat messy. That the current PS party, that this is the one that's driving integration with Europe, that it will have to form a coalition with some other forces, and that this may keep the European vector in place, but probably slow down progress.
And just finally, John, President Zelensky, when he addressed the United Nations, he urged world powers to stop Russia and warning of Putin's plans to expand beyond Ukraine and of the global arms race that the war is fueling. Do you think he's very accurate in his assessment of the consequences of the war?
I think he is accurate in one critical respect, in that Russia's ambitions don't stop at Ukraine. I and others have been saying for a long time now that Russia's ultimate ambition is to redesign or re-engineer the European security system so that it satisfies specific Russian requirements, and principally the need for Russia to have a zone of influence on its borders, which effectively means those countries that are next to Russia should not have the ability to conduct their own independent foreign defense policies. So Russia believes that countries close to it have to pay a price, which is that they have limited sovereignty, and that's because they are located next to a great power, and that's just the way European affairs should work. So in Western Europe, or in Central Europe these days, we have developed since World War II a very sort of different vision of how countries should relate to each other, how security should be managed, and we move beyond this kind of traditional 19th century view of the role of great powers in Europe. So the struggle, I think, is over this concept. And these visions of how Europe should be run are absolutely irreconcilable. So in a way, that's what we're sort of fighting out at the moment. And unfortunately, Ukraine is bearing the brunt of it.
John Lough, great to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.